This mansion was not a dream. It was a mistake that kept charging interest long after the doors were opened. The problem wasn't building the largest private house in America. The problem was everything that had to keep breaking, bending, and obeying just so one man could feel at ease inside it. Because from the outside, the Biltmore Estate looks like permanence. From the inside, it behaves more like a machine that never stops demanding fuel. What most people misunderstand is this: Biltmore was never finished. It was only occupied. And there's a difference that matters. The threat didn't arrive with fire, scandal, or ghost. It arrived quietly, hidden in routine, in heating systems that needed constant attention, in rooms so numerous that absence itself became expensive, in a structure so large that every decision made inside it multiplied its consequences outward, touching people who would never be invited upstairs. Here's the irreversible question that hangs over the estate like a sealed invoice. Who was this house actually built for? And who ended up paying for it in ways no ledger recorded? To understand that, you have to look away from the grand halls and focus instead on what never made it into the postcard. The hours before dawn, the doors marked service, the invisible choreography that had to run perfectly so that silence could be sold as luxury. Biltmore did not function like a home. It functioned like a system, and systems don't care about intention, only throughput. Every day, the house demanded heat, light, water, food, cleaning, coordination, not occasionally, constantly. If one part failed, the illusion collapsed. That meant hundreds of people living on schedules shaped entirely by a building that never slept. Their lives bent around its corridors, its kitchens, its basement. Comfort upstairs required precision downstairs. But that arrangement only worked while money flowed without resistance. The early days felt controlled, almost experimental. New technologies quietly tested the limits of what a private residence could absorb. Elevators removed the burden of stairs for some. Central heating pushed warmth through walls that would otherwise swallow it. Electric systems reduced darkness but increased dependence. Every innovation promised ease, yet each one added another layer that could fail. And failure was never neutral. Because when something went wrong at Biltmore, it didn't simply inconvenience a household. It disrupted an ecosystem. Repairs meant materials. Materials meant transport. Transport meant labor. Labor meant wages that had to be paid whether the house was being enjoyed or not. The structure didn't scale down. It only scaled up. That's the detail most tours glide past. This place could not be paused. You couldn't lock the door and walk away without consequence. Even empty, it consumed. Even silent, it cost. And slowly, almost politely, the house began to dictate terms. It reshaped land around it to feed itself. Forests weren't preserved out of sentiment. They were managed, harvested, replanted, measured. Agriculture wasn't pastoral. It was logistical. The estate needed to justify its own gravity. It had to produce something to offset what it devoured. But production comes with pressure, and pressure exposes crack. The larger the operation became, the more fragile it actually was. Any shift, economic, social, personal, would ripple through the entire structure. A home this size doesn't adapt. It resists. And resistance is expensive. What's unsettling is how long the warning signs stayed invisible. From a distance, Biltmore looked like mastery, control, triumph over scale. But inside the numbers, converted into hours worked. Bodies required, systems maintained. The equation
There was
never
always a
balanced
shortfall.
cleanly. It was just absorbed by people who had no say in the architecture. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because Biltmore didn't collapse. It endured, which meant the cost didn't explode. It accumulated, quietly, patiently, waiting for a moment when the house would no longer be able to pretend it was simply a home. Because no matter how grand the rooms were, no matter how advanced the system seemed, the estate had one flaw no amount of money could engineer away. It was built on the assumption that resource and people would always be available. What happens when that assumption starts to fail? That answer wasn't revealed all at once. It surfaced in fragments, in decisions that felt temporary, in compromises that were framed as sensible, in changes that no one announced, but everyone felt. And the house kept standing, which made the cost harder to see. So the real danger of Biltmore was never that it might fall. It was that it wouldn't, and would keep demanding payment from whoever happened to be closest when the bill came due. Do you want me to continue to the next chapter? The first signs didn't look like failure. They looked like refinement. More staff, more specialization, more rules about who could go where and when. The house didn't announce this shift, but it enforced it. Corridors narrowed, doors multiplied. Some staircases became invisible by design. What looked like efficiency was actually containment. Because a house this large could not afford spontaneity, every movement had to be predicted. Meals didn't simply appear. They were scheduled days in advance, coordinated across rooms that never shared walls. Fireplaces burned in spaces no one entered that day, simply because letting them go cold risked damp, rot, repair. Silence upstairs meant constant motion below. The system only worked if everyone stayed in their place. Servants didn't just work at Biltmore, they orbited it. Their days were segmented into functions, not hours. Someone who understood the boilers could not simply leave. Someone trained for the laundry rooms carried knowledge the house depended on. The building remembered people even when it pretended not to see them. That's the inversion most visitors miss. The house was not serving its owner. The owner was feeding the house, because comfort at that scale isn't passive. It's manufactured, and manufacturing requires labor that compounds quietly. One more guest meant dozens of additional tasks. One extra day of occupancy meant weeks of preparation and aftermath. But this pressure didn't create rebellion. It created silence. People adapted. They always do. Systems count on that. Schedules tighten. Living quarters shrank. The distance between the people who enjoyed the house and the people who sustained it became structural, not emotional. Structural. You could map it in stone. And as long as money moved predictably, the imbalance felt stable. That illusion mattered, because the moment anyone questioned the cost, the entire logic of the estate wobbled. Biltmore was justified by its own continuity. It existed because it existed. Stopping would have been more expensive than continuing, so no one stopped. Instead, the estate expanded its footprint beyond the house itself. Forests became assets. Fields became calculation. What looked like stewardship was also necessity. The land wasn't curated for beauty alone. It was optimized to keep the house viable. This is where the story subtly shifts scale. Because Biltmore wasn't just a mansion anymore. It was a private economy. And private economies are fragile in ways palaces aren't. They depend on external conditions staying favorable, on markets behaving, on labor remaining available, on the assumption that yesterday's surplus will cover tomorrow's demand. But assumptions are debts with delayed due dates. The house demanded heat even when rooms were empty. It demanded maintenance even when seasons changed. It demanded presence even when the people who built it wanted distance. The larger it grew, the less flexible it became. And flexibility is what systems need to survive change. What no one said out loud, because saying it would have been unthinkable, was that the estate was already too big to be personal. Decisions about it were no longer domestic choices. They were managerial ones. That shift matters, because once a home becomes an operation, intimacy disappears. And without intimacy, attachment turns abstract. You don't feel the cost directly. You read it in reports. You delegate the discomfort. You let time absorb the consequences. For a while, that worked. The house still hosted, still impressed, still functioned. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Inside, everything ran, barely, on synchronization and discipline. But systems built on abundance don't fail dramatically at first. They strain, they creak, they ask for small concessions. A parcel of land here, a reduction there, a decision framed as practical, not symbolic. No one called it retreat. Yet, what's unsettling is how normal it all felt while it was happening. The routines hardened, the hierarchy stabilized, the costs became familiar enough to ignore. And that's when the house crossed an invisible line. Because from that point on, it no longer needed ambition to sustain it. It needed sacrifice, not all at once, not publicly, but steadily, from the edges inward. The question was no longer whether Biltmore could exist. The question was, how much could be given up to keep it standing, and who would be asked to give first. The shift wasn't announced. It never is. There was no single moment when Biltmore crossed from indulgence into burden. Instead, it happened the way pressure always accumulates, through maintenance, obligation, and time doing what time does best, changing the rules without asking permission. The house had been designed as a refuge, a place where the outside world could be curated, filtered, slowed. But the irony was brutal. The more isolated the estate tried to become, the more exposed it actually was to forces it couldn't control. Because a house that large doesn't escape history, it concentrates it. As years passed, the rhythms that once felt experimental hardened into dependency. Heating systems aged, electrical components required constant upgrades. What had once been cutting-edge quietly became fragile. Innovation, at scale, has an expiration date, and when it expires inside a structure this large, replacement isn't optional, it's existential. But replacing systems costs money, and money behaves differently once it's responsible for sustaining an entire ecosystem rather than indulging a vision. The estate's finances became less about growth and more about defense, preventing deterioration, avoiding embarrassment, keeping appearances intact. The house didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to not fail visibly. That distinction mattered, because once visibility became the primary concern, priorities shifted. Some rooms stopped being used. Some wings became symbolic, rather than functional. The house began to hollow itself out strategically, preserving the image of fullness, while quietly reducing its actual footprint. This wasn't decay, it was adaptation, and adaptation always has a human cost. Staff roles blurred, fewer people were asked to do more. Expertise became concentrated, which made the system even more brittle. When knowledge lives in too few hands, absence becomes a threat. Illness mattered. Departure mattered. Every change echoed. At the same time, the world outside the gates accelerated. Economic cycles tightened. Social expectations shifted. Wealth stopped being an unquestioned virtue and started attracting scrutiny. The very scale that once signaled triumph began to signal exit. Biltmore couldn't shrink to meet that change. It could only endure it. And endurance is expensive. The estate still hosted gatherings, but their tone subtly changed. What once felt celebratory now felt performative. Grandeur became something to defend rather than enjoy. Every event carried an unspoken question. Was this worth it? No one answered out loud. Instead, compromises accumulated. Portions of land were reconsidered. Uses were reassessed. Decisions that would have been unthinkable at the beginning were now framed as responsible stewardship. That framing mattered, because it softened the reality. It made reduction sound like wisdom rather than necessity. But necessity was driving everything. The house demanded constant attention, and attention is a finite resource. The more time spent managing Biltmore, the less remained for anything else. The estate wasn't just consuming money, it was consuming focus. That's when the balance tipped. Because wealth can absorb cost, but it struggles with distraction. And Biltmore had become a full-time problem disguised as a legacy. The systems that once symbolized control now dictated behavior. Decisions were no longer made for pleasure, curiosity, or comfort. They were made to keep the machine running, and machines don't care who feeds them. What's disturbing is how normalized this became. The house's needs were treated as natural, inevitable, as if a building this large had the right to demand sacrifices simply because it existed. And so it did. Quietly, the estate began to outlive the intentions that created it. It no longer reflected a personal vision. It reflected inertia. The difficulty of undoing something that had grown too large to reverse cleanly. At this stage, Biltmore wasn't failing. It was succeeding at something no one had planned for, becoming permanent. But permanence is dangerous when it outlasts relevance, because the longer something stands, the more it pressures the people around it to justify its survival. And justification is never free. The question hovering now wasn't whether the house could continue. It was whether anyone still had the freedom to choose otherwise. Because once a structure reaches this scale, Choosing to let it go stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like a betrayal of history, of effort, of everyone who had already paid. And that emotional weight was about to become just as binding as the financial one. The moment permanence sets in, choice becomes an illusion. By the time that realization surfaced, Biltmore was no longer just a residence or even an estate. It was a liability with a legacy attached. And that combination is uniquely dangerous. Because you can abandon a cost, you hesitate to abandon a symbol. What followed wasn't collapse. It was something far more deliberate. The land began to change hands, not all at once, not dramatically, but strategically. Parcels that once existed to support the house were reframed as excess. Forests became negotiable. Fields became divisible. What had been assembled to sustain the mansion was now being dismantled to save it. That paradox is critical. The house could only survive by sacrificing the very scale that justified its existence in the first place. And each reduction made the original vision harder to recognize. This wasn't failure, it was triage. Selling land didn't feel like loss when it was described as preservation. When forests became public, the narrative softened. The estate wasn't shrinking, it was contributing. Responsibility replaced pride. Necessity disguised itself as foresight. But underneath that language sat a simpler truth. The estate could no longer afford itself. Because land wasn't just scenery. It was revenue, insulation, buffer. Once it was gone, the house stood more exposed to weather, to economics, to public opinion. What had been private became watched. What had been indulgent became accountable. And accountability changes behavior. The estate adjusted again. Access was reconsidered. The idea of privacy, once absolute, became flexible. Carefully, cautiously, the house began to entertain the unthinkable, being seen not as a home, but as a destination. That shift didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't celebrated internally. Opening a private space to outsiders isn't generosity. It's a calculation, one that trades intimacy for solvency. Visitors don't arrive quietly. They bring scrutiny. They bring expectations. They bring wear. But they also, at this stage, cash. Biltmore entered its most delicate phase. It had to remain impressive while becoming useful. It had to preserve mystery while increasing access. It had to sell the illusion of timelessness while constantly adapting behind the scenes. That balancing act required a new kind of labor, not just physical maintenance, but narrative maintenance. Stories had to be shaped, experiences curated, certain aspects emphasized, while others were quietly minimized. The house wasn't lying, but it wasn't telling the whole truth either. Because the full truth would raise uncomfortable questions. Questions about why a single residence ever needed so much land. Why so many systems were required just to maintain normalcy. Why permanence demanded perpetual compromise. The estate learned to redirect attention. Grandeur upstairs, efficiency downstairs. History framed as triumph rather than warning. And most people accepted that framing because it's easier to admire than to interrogate. What's unsettling is how successful this transformation was. The house didn't just survive, it stabilized. The machine found a new fuel source. Visitors replaced surplus. Ticketed access replaced privacy. The cost shifted outward. But shifting cost doesn't erase it. It just redistributes it. Maintenance still mattered. Systems still aged. Rooms still demanded climate control, whether anyone stood in them or not. The scale problem never disappeared. It was simply absorbed into a different model. And models have limits. The more the estate relied on its image, the more fragile that image became. A bad season, a downturn, a change in taste. Suddenly, sustainability wasn't guaranteed. It was conditional. This is where Biltmore's story becomes less about wealth and more about dependency. Because once an institution relies on constant engagement to survive, it loses the ability to retreat. It must always perform, always justify itself, always remain relevant. The house couldn't go quiet, even if it wanted to. What began as a retreat from the world had become something that needed the world's attention to keep standing. That inversion matters, because it means the estate's fate was no longer controlled by intention or inheritance. It was controlled by momentum, by systems layered on top of systems, by decisions made long ago that could no longer be undone cleanly. Biltmore wasn't trapped by a single mistake. It was trapped by accumulation. And accumulation doesn't end. It just changes form. The house still stands. The rooms are still there. The walls still carry their weight. But the question has shifted again. It's no longer about how much it costs to maintain the estate. It's about what it costs to keep believing it was ever just a home. Once the estate accepted attention as fuel, silence became a liability. Biltmore learned quickly that visibility was no longer optional. Empty rooms no longer signified restraint or privacy. They represented lost revenue. Each unused corridor became a missed opportunity. Each closed door, an inefficiency. The house began to measure itself not by comfort, but by throughput. How many people could pass through without breaking the illusion? That question quietly reshaped everything. Paths were optimized, narratives standardized. What guests were allowed to see became just as important as what they were never meant to notice. The estate didn't simply open its doors, it edited itself. Behind the scenes, the pressure intensified. Maintenance cycles tightened because failure was no longer private. A malfunction wasn't just inconvenient, it was reputational. Systems that had once been allowed to creak quietly now had to perform flawlessly, on schedule, in front of an audience. And audiences are unforgiving. The paradox was sharp. The more people admired the house, the more fragile it became. Foot traffic wore floors. Breath changed humidity. Heat from bodies altered climate control demand. What felt like admiration translated directly into strain. So, the house demanded more labor. Not fewer servants, more specialized ones. Conservators, engineers, coordinators, staff whose entire job was preventing visitors from realizing how much work it took to make effort invisible. That invisibility was expensive. And because the estate now depended on constant engagement, downtime vanished. There were no true off-seasons anymore, only slower ones. Even when fewer guests arrived, the systems stayed active. Climate control didn't pause, security didn't sleep, preservation didn't negotiate. The house still consumed at the same rate. Only the income fluctuated. That imbalance introduced a new anxiety. Predictability disappeared. Before, the estate relied on wealth that absorbed shocks. Now it relied on attendance, interest, relevance. Those things are volatile. They change with trends, economics, and attention span, which meant the estate had to do something it was never designed to do: compete. It had to compete with other destinations, with changing tastes, with narratives that questioned whether celebrating such excess was appropriate at all. So the story shifted again. Biltmore became heritage, education, culture. Its existence reframed as service rather than indulgence. The house wasn't defended as personal achievement. It was justified as public value. That reframing worked, mostly, but it came with constraints. Public value demands accountability, transparency, explanation. The estate had to answer questions it once ignored. Why so large? Why so costly? Why preserve this instead of something else? Each answer required careful calibration. Too honest, and the illusion cracked. Too polished, and skepticism grew. So the house lived in a narrow corridor between admiration and critique. Inside that corridor, the pressure never let up. The estate couldn't downsize without betraying its identity. It couldn't expand without provoking backlash. It couldn't rest without risking decay. Every option carried cost. What's unsettling is how normalized this tension became. The house adapted, but adaptation doesn't equal relief. It just redistributes stress. And stress always looks for weak points. The weak point wasn't structural. The walls held. The foundations endured. The weakness was conceptual, because the estate was now sustaining itself not as a home, but as an idea. And ideas require constant reinforcement. They erode when neglected. That meant constant storytelling, constant relevance, constant justification. The house had become a performance that could never end. Visitors left impressed, but they also left with expectations. Expectations of access, of novelty, of experience. Meeting those expectations required change, and change threatened authenticity. So the estate walked a tightrope, preserved too much, and it felt stagnant. Adapt too much, and it felt compromised. Every decision invited criticism from somewhere. And yet, stopping wasn't an option. Because once a structure this large ties its survival to public engagement, retreat becomes indistinguishable from failure. Closing doors feels like surrender. Silence feels like collapse. So the lights stayed on. The tours continued. The systems kept running. And the house kept asking the same question it had been asking since the beginning, only now louder and more urgent. What must be given up next to keep me standing? Because the cost of Biltmore was never fixed. It evolved. First, it consumed land, then labor, then privacy, then narrative control. What remained to be sacrificed was less tangible, but more revealing. Time, the freedom, meaning to let something end. And that's where the story tightens again. Because when permanence becomes the goal, history stops being something you inherit and starts being something you're trapped inside. By the time the estate began to feel like a trap, it was already too integrated into everything around it to be questioned honestly. That's the danger of longevity. The longer something survives, the harder it becomes to imagine its absence. Biltmore was no longer just a building or a destination. It was employment, identity, expectation. Entire routines, entire livelihoods had wrapped themselves around its continued existence. Ending it would no longer be an architectural decision. It would be a social one. And social decisions carry blame. So the house stayed. And with every passing year, preservation replaced intention as the guiding principle. The goal was no longer to ask what the estate should be. The goal was to ensure it remained what it already was. That distinction changed everything. Preservation sounds neutral, responsible, even noble. But preservation at this scale is aggressive. It requires intervention, correction, constant adjustment. Materials must be replaced with replicas of themselves. Systems must be modernized without appearing modern. Damage must be reversed without leaving evidence it ever occurred. Time is treated as an enemy, and fighting time is expensive. The house entered a phase where nothing was allowed to age naturally. Wear became unacceptable. Patina was tolerated only if it could be framed as authenticity. Anything that hinted at decline triggered action. That vigilance created a strange contradiction. The estate was marketed as historical, yet it could never truly become old. It had to remain suspended in a carefully curated version of itself, frozen but active. This demanded a new kind of labor, one focused not on use, but on prevention. Teams whose sole purpose was to anticipate decay before it became visible. Moisture tracked, air measured, materials monitored. The house was no longer lived in. It was managed like a patient in perpetual care. And like any patient kept alive indefinitely, the question of quality of life quietly disappeared. What mattered was survival. That survival depended on relevance, which meant the estate had to continue justifying why it deserved resources over other priorities. Roads, schools, housing, all things competing, indirectly, with a mansion built for a single family long gone. The justification was history. But history is selective. The estate emphasized innovation, artistry, ambition. Less attention was paid to the imbalance, the dependency, the way the house distorted everything around it simply by existing at that scale. Those elements complicated the narrative, and complication threatens support. So the story stayed controlled. What's unsettling is how easily that control blended into normality. Visitors accepted the framing. Preservation became synonymous with value. The sheer difficulty of maintaining the house became proof that it was worth maintaining. Cost became evidence of importance. That logic is circular and powerful, because once something is declared irreplaceable, no price feels too high. Every expense becomes necessary. Every sacrifice becomes justified. The question stops being, should this continue? And becomes, how do we afford not to? That's the trap Biltmore settled into. Not collapse, not scandal, but institutional inertia. The estate couldn't fail loudly, because failure would have required a decision. Instead, it succeeded quietly, by absorbing more resources, more attention, more justification. And over time, the house stopped reflecting the era that created it, and started reflecting the era that refused to let it go. That refusal shaped everything. Renovations were framed as preservation, commercialization as education, access as generosity. Each reframing softened resistance and extended the timeline. But timelines always end. What no one could say out loud was that the estate's greatest threat was no longer economics or relevance. It was permanence itself. The longer it stood, the more it demanded that the future accommodate the past. And the future is not obligated to do that. Biltmore had become too large to ignore and too symbolic to release. It occupied a space where criticism felt disrespectful and defense felt automatic. That's when structures stop being questioned and start being protected by default. Yet underneath all of it, the same equation remained unresolved. The house still required constant energy, constant labor, constant narrative maintenance. Nothing had changed except who was paying and why. And that's the quiet revelation at this stage of the story. Biltmore didn't escape its original problem. It perfected it. It learned how to survive without ever answering whether it should. And as long as survival remained the only metric, the house would continue to win, while the cost became harder to locate, harder to name, and harder to refuse. Which leaves one final question hanging over everything that remains. Not how long Biltmore can stand, but what standing has already replaced. At some point, endurance stops being admirable and starts being automatic. That's where Biltmore exists now, not as a choice renewed each generation, but as a condition inherited. The estate no longer asks permission to continue. It assumes continuation is the default, and everything else must bend around that assumption. This is the final transformation. The house is no longer defended because of who built it, or why it was built, or even what it represents. It is defended because stopping feels impossible, because letting it fade would feel like erasing effort, labor, memory, identity. And once something becomes emotionally untouchable, it gains extraordinary power. Power without accountability. The estate still frames itself as preservation, but preservation has quietly replaced reflection. There is little space left to ask whether this structure, this scale, this cost, still deserves priority in a world that has fundamentally changed. Instead, the question has narrowed. How do we keep this going? That narrowing is revealing, because it mirrors the original mistake that set everything in motion. From the beginning, Biltmore was never designed around limits. It was designed around assumption of resources, of labor, of stability, of relevance. And every era since has inherited that same assumption, simply translated into new language. Where money once flowed freely, attention now must. Where private wealth once absorbed cost, public interest now does. The mechanism changed, but the logic didn't. The house still requires disproportionate energy. It still consumes more than it gives back in any measurable sense. Its value exists largely in what it represents, not what it produces. And representation is fragile. It depends on belief. Belief that this is worth it. What's uncomfortable is how rarely that belief is challenged, not because answers are clear, but because the question itself feels taboo. Questioning Biltmore doesn't feel like analyzing a building. It feels like questioning history, culture, identity. That emotional shield is powerful, and it's why the estate survives without ever fully justifying itself in contemporary terms. The house stands because it has learned to turn difficulty into virtue. The harder it is to maintain, the more it is praised. The more resources it absorbs, the more important it seems. Cost has become its own defense. That inversion should feel familiar. It's the same logic that protects systems long after they stop serving the world that built them. Institutions, traditions, structures that persist, not because they adapt meaningfully, but because dismantling them feels more dangerous than sustaining them. Biltmore is no longer just a mansion, it's a case study. A case study in how excess hardens into heritage, how scale becomes inertia, how decisions made in confidence can trap generations in maintenance rather than purpose. And here is the quietest, most unsettling truth in the entire story. The house won, not by dominating the landscape or surviving economic shifts, or reinventing itself as a destination, but by outlasting the question of whether it should exist at all. Once that question disappears, anything can endure. The estate no longer belongs to one man or even one family. It belongs to momentum, to the fear of loss, to the idea that stopping would mean admitting something fundamental was wrong from the start, and societies are rarely ready to admit that. So the lights remain on, the corridors stay polished, the systems hum behind walls designed to hide effort. Visitors walk through rooms built for silence, never noticing how loud survival actually is. The house still stands. The name is still spoken with admiration. The story is still told as triumph, but the price never stopped being paid. It just became harder to see who is still paying it, and what else might have existed in its place if the courage to let go had arrived sooner. Because the most macabre part of America's largest mansion isn't what happened inside its walls. It's what had to be postponed, redirected, or sacrificed so those walls could remain standing at all. And that cost was never confined to the house.